Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
You're with Give the People What They Want. Nice to be with you. We're in the midpoint of June. Give the People What They Want, brought to you by People's Dispatch. That's Zoe and Prashad. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. Very happy to be with you. Also very happy to see images coming out of Cuba of Kerala's Chief Minister Pinarayi Vijayan traveling the country, going to the sports ministry where he had a discussion about how Cuba's quite remarkable sports authority might send coaches to help coach young sports people in Kerala and so on. And then, of course, he met with President Miguel Diaz-Canel to have a discussion about Kerala-Cuba relations, India's relations with Cuba. India has a considerable history of solidarity with the Cuban Revolution. Mr. Pinarayi Vijayan met a range of government and non-government officials and people in Cuba. Very pleased to see this meeting take place. Of course, this meeting taking place at a time when Cuba is struggling with terrific sanctions put in place, extra sanctions put in place because Cuba hosted the historical peace agreement between the Colombian government and the various armed factions. A great irony that the state sponsor of peace, which is Cuba, is being called a state sponsor of terrorism by the US government, which in fact inflicts unilateral pressure against the Cuban government. Well, let's not spend the whole time talking about Cuba, Zoe, although that is very easy to do. Let's move on to Ecuador, a country which has had its own stresses and strains in recent years. Seems like every time we talk about Ecuador, there's an election. And this time, perhaps it's an important one. What's happening in Ecuador?
Yes, we are back to the time of elections. You thought we were done with elections, but this year, end of the year, it's going to be a lot. We have Ecuador, there's Argentina, and the primaries in Mexico, which we'll get to later. But specifically Ecuador, you're right that we have been talking a lot about elections there. And these elections happened because Guillermo Lasso, as we reported earlier, activated the very dramatic sounding cross-death measure, essentially because he was under great political pressure by the parliament, which is really controlled by opposition. And they were investigating him for several different serious crimes involving links to drug trafficking groups, corruption, money laundering. I mean, all sorts of very serious charges. And he preferred to not go through with the impeachment trial, which probably would have had him removed, and decided to activate this cross-death measure, which essentially dissolves the parliament. So there's currently no parliament in Ecuador. He is ruling by decree, and elections will be held in August. The electoral calendar has been announced. There's going to be a very, very tight campaign period. There's already 8 different presidential tickets announced. Amongst those, Andrés Arauz, who's running vice president, with Luisa Gonzalez, is the presidential candidate for the Citizens Revolution ticket. It's going to be an interesting contest, especially given the fact that back in February in local elections, the Citizens Revolution actually performed quite well. They had an important setback in the 2021 elections, of course, when Andrés Arauz was unable to win the second round after winning the first round in the presidential elections. But because of the kind of mismanagement that we've seen under Guillermo Lasso, the complete destruction of the country under Lenin Moreno, who, by the way, actually ejected the ELN peace talks, and Cuba, being the state sponsor of peace, graciously opened their doors to actually host these talks and make sure that they could become a reality. But if it had been for Lenin Moreno's Ecuador, these peace talks probably would have never happened. And so important point there. And the country has really gone from crisis to crisis, economic crisis. There's been this massive scandal of these prison massacres, which Guillermo Lasso has really done nothing to tackle, despite many recommendations from human rights organizations in the country. A whole slew of things. And now, once again, they're going back to the polls, which is, of course, again, bringing unnecessary instability, bringing once again, I mean, this is going to be a whole political charade. There's 8 different tickets, very interesting personalities. I recommend you check out the article prepared by Tanya Wadwa at People's Dispatch, thoroughly going through all of these different candidates and their platforms. But we'll definitely be following it. Ecuador continues to be a key ground for struggle, and it also really indicates kind of the direction and future of what's happening on the continent.
It's very important. We'll be keeping track of that as we keep track of all elections, it seems, that takes place in Latin America. But that is an important front of struggle for the people in that region. Meanwhile, where there are no elections, namely, no elections that seem to count. When there was an election in 2006, the United States forced the annulment of it. And I'm talking about Palestine, of course. Prashant, the front of struggle seems to be in the prisons. It seems to be with hunger strikes. Tell us again what is happening in Palestine.
Right, Vijay, on June 18th, Palestinian prisoners are set to go on strike across Palestine. And this follows a series of developments and a process which has been going on for many months of protests. We saw recently the case of Walid Daka being raised, who is in his 37th year of imprisonment. He was imprisoned in 1986, one of the few people who was not released after the Oslo Accords as well. Now, Walid Daka has been diagnosed with cancer recently, and there's been there's been a demand across Palestine that he be released for his treatment as well, and the fact that he's of course a writer, intellectual, and other things, but also on the most basic human grounds of being able to access treatment. But this has been time and again denied by Israeli authorities on various procedural grounds. But Walid Daka's case is just one. We know that just a couple of months ago, another Palestinian administrative detainee, Khader Adnan, died in the beginning of May, and this was after a hunger strike, and he was an administrative detainee. And this also reflects a time when I think there has been an increasing ill treatment of Palestinians in prisons. It was always extremely bad, but it has only gone worse since the Benjamin Netanyahu government came to power. We remember, for instance, Itamar Ben-Gvir making very objectionable statements about how the bread was fresh bread. The Palestinian prisoners should not get fresh bread, for instance. And this is reflected in a lot of, what are basic necessities of prisoners being denied by the occupation forces. So, for instance, the numbers are pretty staggering. I think there are about 700 Palestinians in Israeli prisons and detention centers who are suffering from chronic health issues and various life-threatening ailments. And we have a couple of articles which have actually talked about the condition in various prisons, various Israeli prisons. And this, of course, like I said, is part of a larger policy of oppression that Israel follows. The total number of Palestinian prisoners is around 5,000, and of whom around 1,200 are administrative detainees. Now, we talked about administrative detention before. It's this policy whereby, say, Palestinians who are picked up on any charges can be just almost indefinitely detained without any charge or trial on the basis of the fact that the Israeli prosecution provides what is secret evidence, and the judge is convinced over this. And this has been relentlessly used against Palestinians who engage in resistance, especially political leaders, intellectuals. A cross-section of Palestinian society has been targeted with it. Women have been targeted, children have been targeted. So all of them, I think 14 minors, 14 minus the total number of prisoners, but 1,200 prisoners are facing administrative detention. And this year and in the past few months, we've seen a spike in the number of these orders that are going through. And it's important to remember that once someone is detained at administrative detention, there is no clarity on how long they can be held, because it depends on, every 6 months the case comes up and then an order is passed and the detention again continues. So this has been a very important focus of the protests of prisoners, along with the provision of basic necessities in prisons, which all prisoners, not to mention prisoners held by occupation forces, should be getting. So all this together, I think a very key moment in the continuing Palestinian protests that are going on. And a lot of the resistance has focused on the cause of prisoners. And like you said, the case of prisoners has been one of the front lines of struggle by Palestinians as well. So we'll be covering these issues, of course, in the coming days, but an important moment, I think, in the overall struggle that has been taking place.
let's shift focus away to Europe and NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO is going to hold its annual summit, as it does every summer, in Vilnius, Lithuania, on the 11th and 12th of July. In anticipation of this, Secretary General of NATO Jens Stoltenberg went to the place where he goes to get instructions, went to Washington, D.C., met with high officials of the US government. Meanwhile, interesting development, of course, because NATO expansion has been very much on the surface in recent years, particularly around the conflict with Russia in Ukraine. And, we saw that in May 2022, after the Russian entry into Ukraine, at that point, both Finland and Sweden applied to join NATO as part of this great expansion of NATO. Well, Finland's application to join NATO was accepted, and Finland joined NATO in April of this year. And Finland's entry into NATO was signed off by the Turkish government because it has to be unanimous consent of all NATO members to accept a new member. So Finland joined NATO in April of 2023. Now, the joining of Finland is key because Finland shares a 1,400-kilometer land border with Russia. And the day Finland joined NATO, NATO's direct border with Russia doubled to close to 2,800 kilometers. It's quite considerable. Finland's entry into NATO certainly, of course, sparked a concern in Moscow, but that was a done deal. Now, why wasn't Sweden accepted into NATO in April of this year? After all, both Sweden and Finland had applied to join NATO in May 2022, and both Sweden and Finland gave as the reason for applying to join NATO their anxiety over the Russian entry into Ukraine. But only Finland was accepted in, not Sweden. Curious situation. Well, those who look at this carefully know exactly why Sweden was not allowed. Sweden wasn't allowed because there was no unanimous consent from all NATO members to take Sweden in. Now, that unanimous consent might have been denied by other countries. We don't know. But the country that went out in front and said we will not allow Sweden to join NATO was Turkey. Now, others, as I say, might also have subsequently come out and said we don't want Sweden to join, but that was not the case. Turkey is the country that has been quite vocal about this. A newly re-elected president of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, was in a visit in Central Asia, and while he was asked about this, he said, "Look, we are not going to allow Sweden to join NATO at the Vilnius summit," and he was quite clear that his prime minister and he have no difference of opinion on this. Very interesting. Why is Turkey so bothered about Sweden joining NATO? After all, Turkey didn't object to Finland, which has a direct border, 1,400-kilometer border with Russia. They had no problem with that. So obviously, this has nothing to do with Russia itself. In other words, Turkey isn't carrying a bucket for Russia. There must be something else involved. Well, it has to do with a couple of things. Firstly, Sweden, as some of you might know, has for the last 50-odd years positioned itself as a great defender of human rights. And despite the fact that Sweden is, of course, at the same time, one of the major arms producers in the world, listeners in India will well know about the Bofors gun, a great scandal in the Rajiv Gandhi administration in the 1980s. Bofors is a Swedish company and makes heavy artillery for battlefields and so on. A country that is home to, I guess it's not directly home to the Nobel Prize for Peace, because you'd have to look also at Norway for that. But nonetheless, Sweden, up there as a champion of human rights, actually used its asylum policy pretty liberally, allowing, for instance, Sri Lankan Tamils to enter in large numbers in the 1980s, as well as, well, here we have it, Turkish Kurds. a large number of Turkish Kurdish refugees, political refugees, took refuge in Sweden. And in Sweden, they've been very vocal about their opposition to Mr. Erdogan. But that's not the only issue. Mr. Erdogan directly told Jens Stoltenberg that Sweden has to deal with what he called its terrorism problem. And that is that the Workers' Party of Kurdistan, the PKK, has an office there. But that's not the only issue. The other issue is that Sweden has seen the rise of neo-fascist organizations, including deeply Islamophobic organizations. And there's been a spate of things like the burning of Qurans in public. Here come the contradictions within Europe. On the one side, rising Islamophobia in the Nordic countries, particularly Sweden and Denmark, has the hackles up in Istanbul, where Mr. Erdogan has positioned himself as a kind of defender of Islam. No chance of Sweden joining NATO at Vilnius this summer, but this is something to keep an eye on. The world is made not of straight lines, but of zigs and zags. You're listening to Give the People What They Want, brought to you from People's Dispatch and Globetrotter. Happy to have you with us either live on Friday or via podcast. We're going to go back to the Turkish area because Prashant is going to tell us about yet another Greek migrant tragedy.
Right. It's interesting that you mentioned refugees, Vijay, because the Mediterranean region is actually now one of it's an actual death trap for refugees from across the world, but mainly, especially Africa and conflict-hit parts of Asia. And as we record, I think the latest numbers from the tragedy off the Greek coast is around 79 migrants, refugees who have died due to drowning. And I think it's a specifically horrific incident because the boat they were traveling in, apparently 600 to 700 migrants were aboard that boat, so including many children. So it was just jam-packed. Now, the Greek authorities are saying, of course, that they tried their best to provide rescue, but the refugees refused to do it. Now, there are two aspects to this. Alarm Phone, an organization which works on migrant rights and refugees, for instance, says that indications were provided to authorities early on that this boat was in trouble, but not enough action was taken. But I think some observers have also pointed out, and it's an interesting point, that the reason if, for instance, the migrants said no to being rescued by Greek authorities, could also have been the fact that the brutality of Greek authorities towards refugees is extremely notorious. So even though they were in an extremely difficult condition, what did they say no? Because of the fact that they rather preferred the risk of floating at sea rather than being captured by or handled by Greek authorities. So I think this really is kind of a very illustrative, unfortunately, a very illustrative tragedy. We come every 2 or 3 months, we talk about one of these incidents, and nothing really seems to change. And if you look, for instance, at what is called the Central Mediterranean region, I think the numbers are pretty disastrous. Since 2014, 21,000 migrants have died or gone missing in that region. And in the whole of the Mediterranean, the number is 27,000. And in this Central Mediterranean region alone, that's 21,000 people who have gone missing or died in many of these accidents. And 2023 especially has seen a huge increase in these numbers as well. It's been the deadliest year on record. And I think it's important to also sort of connect it to another report which has come out recently. That's the UN High Commission for Refugees report on the refugee crisis in the globe overall. And that also presents some very depressing numbers. I think 110 million people are forcibly displaced. Now, of course, Ukraine and Sudan are major reasons for last year's displacement. But one interesting line in that report, which I think does not probably get enough attention, is that the report says that from 2011 onwards, there has been a rapid spike in the number of refugees. Until 2011, it was relatively stable. But from 2011, we see this drastic spike that takes place. And since every year, it's sort of, their numbers have been very high. And then the question arises, what happened in 2011? And in 2011, that time period is when Libya and Syria happened. And, even the Iraq violence also. But most importantly, Libya and Syria, the interventions by the US and its allies in Libya and Syria begin around that time. And, today, if you look at some of the countries which are worst hit, by what is called the refugee crisis. Syria is definitely one of them. Libya is one of the centers of many migrants for many migrants to leave. And Libya also is, Libyan authorities have been paid by the EU to sort of create these very horrible, horrendous camps where migrants are again so-called processed. So it's no surprise that from 2011 was the year when things really began to escalate. So due to wars, due to climate change, there's this many of these conflict hit zones have become people leaving in large numbers. And again, also worsened by the fact that countries like the UK or Hungary, many of them passing very strict laws to curtail the flow of refugees, many of them adopting racist attitudes. We saw them last year when people were openly saying that refugees from Ukraine, okay, we can take care of them, but from anywhere else, they're not our people. So I think all of this reflecting on what is really a sort of larger perennial question, that how do European countries address this issue? Do they just go with these violent theories of what is called the great replacement or some thing of that sort? Or is there any reckoning that takes place for all these policies and all these wars they have continued to unleash?
Prashant, one of the ships that helped rescue 106 of these migrants is called Mayan Queen 4. It's owned by one of the wealthiest Mexican families. They're a silver family that owns silver mines, the Bayeres family. I'm sure the boat was used for the rescue because it was there. I'm not sure they are looking carefully at what's happening in the next Mexican election, Zoe, because people like the Bayeres family seem to do well regardless of who's in power. But I gather back to an election in Mexico this time.
That's exactly right. 2024 will be the next general elections in Mexico, and it's definitely elections that are looked at with a lot of interest, a lot of prospect, specifically because of the historic victory of Andrés Manuel López Obrador in 2018, winning with the Morena Party, in alliance with the Green Party and the Workers' Party. Truly historic, breaking decades of rule by PRI and PAN, really parties that represent the ruling class that have been embroiled in corruption and responsible for so many other crimes linked to drug trafficking groups, etc. And the victory of López Obrador in 2018 really changed the course of Mexican politics. Back in April, myself and Rania Khalek were lucky enough to actually speak to Claudia Sheinbaum, who's the current or was the head of government in Mexico City, and also spoke in Andrés Manuel's press conference. Very, very interesting scene there. And now the party of both Sheinbaum and López Obrador, Morena, has announced that they are going to hold inter-party primaries to elect who will be the person that succeeds Andrés Manuel in these upcoming elections. As I said, these are highly historic elections. Not only did AMLO break through this ruling class party dominance over the Mexican political system, but he's a president who's had a 70% approval rating. And so most of the pollsters predict that Morena will definitely win the next elections. Just due to their performance in the country, the peso has actually made a historic comeback. It's actually gaining strength compared to the dollars. That's at about 17 pesos to the dollar, which is really historic for that currency. And many other indexes, their ability to achieve energy sovereignty. It has become an extremely popular rule in the country. And now the main kind of debate, the main contention is really who's going to succeed. And so this week, Morena announced that it will be holding these primaries, and that between Claudia Sheinbaum, who just had to resign from her post as Mexico City's governor, Marcelo Ebrard, Adán Augusto, and Ricardo Monreal. These are going to be the four contenders. And according to the rules of these primaries, they all had to resign from their current post. So that's why we saw Marcelo Ebrard step down as foreign minister of Mexico. We saw a new foreign minister take over. And so right now they're going to be in the full primary campaign process. There's many different regulations for how these are going to take place. There's going to be an internal Morena count of these primaries. There's also going to be an external pollster. Very, very interesting. For many people, this is really where the debate's going to happen. We'll be following it very closely. This could really mark, I mean, Mexico is one of the largest countries in the region. It has one of the largest borders with the United States, and the future of Mexico, as we've seen during the government of AMLO, really has also marked the destiny of the region. We've seen so many of the policies that AMLO has taken forward have a tremendous impact on the region as a whole. Him not going to the Summit of the Americas, his strong stance to nationalize key industries in Mexico, his friendship with the Cuban people. These are all key moves that actually, if this continues, if this trajectory of the fourth generation, the fourth transformation of change continues, could really continue to have such big impacts on the region as a whole and on the world.
It's going to be important. We'll be looking at it carefully. Part of this new mood that seems to be there in countries like Mexico, in Turkey, and of course in South Africa, India. What can one say? The foreign minister out there saying that, India doesn't want to follow the NATO template. Very interesting use of that phrase, NATO template, by the Indian foreign minister. Well, the South African foreign minister, Naledi Pandor, in the news because of the very strong position that her government has taken to say that when the BRICS meeting is held in South Africa in August, South Africa will not collaborate with the International Criminal Court in executing an arrest warrant against Russian President Vladimir Putin. Nalini Pandor has received a lot of pushback from the opposition Democratic Alliance, very strangely named political party, the heirs of the apartheid system, in fact. Very strong words against Foreign Minister Pandor from them, using kind of Russia-phobic language to indicate what is in fact South Africa's, sense of the world and how they are seeing things. Meanwhile, of course, you remember that in December 2022, the administration of US President Joe Biden held an Africa-US summit in Washington, D.C. There have been follow-up summits. There was just a summit recently for business leaders and so on. Well, there's a summit to be held on the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act Forum. It's this act passed by the US government. It is to expire in 2025. And there's an annual forum for US and African leaders to basically have a conversation about a US law. That meeting was to be held in South Africa, the 2023 AGOA Forum. Now, angered by this, several important members of the US Congress, the head of the Subcommittee on State Foreign Operations, Christopher Coons, ranking member James Reich of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Gregory Meeks, and so on and so forth, sent a very strong letter to Antony Blinken, in which they basically argue, and the letter itself is worth reading because it shows you the level of thought that is there in the US high offices. Well, they argued there that South Africa's insistence upon holding the BRICS meeting, not willing to arrest Mr. Putin, continuing to support Russia, possible violating US sanctions laws. They said, because of all that, these actions by South Africa, and I'm reading their letter now, call into question its eligibility for trade benefits under the African Growth and Opportunity Act. In other words, now they are thinking of sanctioning South Africa for not honoring sanctions on Russia. This would be, in a sense, an indirect sanction of South Africa. We question, they write, whether a country in danger of losing AGOA benefits should have the privilege of hosting the 2023 AGOA Forum. And then finally, they say that the United States government must send a clear and important message that the United States continues to stand with Ukraine, etc., etc. This is putting a lot of pressure on the South African government. Looks like They're still going to host the BRICS. Qi Gang, the foreign minister of China, recently had a conversation with Nalini Pandor. Looks like they're still going to host the BRICS. Looks like the AGOA summit is still going to be held in South Africa. Looks like the pressure is not going to amount to much. You're listening to Give the People What They Want, brought to you from People's Dispatch. That's peoplesdispatch.org. That's Zoe and Prashant. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. We'll see you next week.